So today we're going to be talking about how to critique an article, and we're going to use this article, The Treatment of Flying Phobia. It actually comes from a book called Critical Thinking About Research, and it's a made-up article, and they were looking, to create studies that would be interesting for us to read. So there's some things in this article that wouldn't be happening in real research, and we'll kind of get into the details of that as we go through this. But as we go through this article, I just wanted to point out how I would read a research article and give you the tips that I think of. But before watching this video, please go ahead and read the article. I want to see what you get out of it first, and then you can see what I get out of it, because we're going to probably get different things. People, as I've read research critiques, people get different things out of different articles. So I think it's important that you read it first. So one of the first things that I do as I read a research article, I avoid reading the abstract. And I do this on purpose because the abstract is the author's summary of what they found in the article, what the article's about. I want to read the article and make my own judgment on what's in the article, so I don't really read the abstract. I avoid the abstract. And with the introduction, so the introduction is really the author's way of selling us on the importance of the research and telling us what the hypotheses are. So they're going to get to the hypotheses by telling us all that's been found in the literature. So they're going to start off with a broad statement of what the problem is. And then they're going to tell us what's been found in the literature and eventually the gap in the literature and how their study finds the gap. So let's see what they find in this article. So they start off with, according to Woodward, 1992, approximately 32.5 million Americans are afraid of flying to some degree. That's a really good problem statement. So they've come up with a really big problem. That's a lot of people are afraid of flying. Commonplace fear is ruling out travel for 15 million people. I take from this that people can't go see family members. It might hurt their occupation. It might hurt all kinds of things. And so they kind of put that there. And then they also talk about the airlines. And to me, it's important, of course, for the airlines. But I think of all the other, as a psychologist, I think of the other human reasons. So then they talk about comprehensive summary of different treatments. They found that psychoanalytic, interpersonal, rational emotive, behavioral, hypnosis are among the approaches. Purpose of this study is to compare two promising approaches, systematic desensitization and implosion therapy. What I don't like about this article, they talk about what other studies that have looked at these other things, and they're going to choose these two different things. They don't really give us any rationale why they chose systematic desensitization and implosion therapy. I'd like to know, they later on they describe what these are, but why did they choose these two? Are these the two most promising, the two most effective, and they're trying to compare how these two relate, how they compare to each other? They don't really give us a good reason why they chose these two. They just say that there's a bunch of them, we chose these two. That's not a very good argument for this study, why there's a gap in the literature, and why they want to use these two types of therapy. And then they basically describe the two types of therapy over here. Just as a quick aside, as somebody who treats anxiety disorders, we don't use systematic desensitization or implosion therapy. We use exposure therapy, where we expose people to what they fear. We usually do it in a hierarchical manner, where we take a small step, expose them to something. They have a fear response, they get past their fear response, and then we keep adding to that as they go through therapy. So neither one of these approaches is really used much anymore, just as a quick aside. The other thing that I'm looking for in this introduction is why the study's important. So we know that it's a big problem. We know that there's been treatments used for it, we have no idea what the gap in the literature, what we don't know about the different treatments is. We've got these effective ones. Maybe they're looking at mechanisms. It's nice to know what the mechanisms are. They don't tell us anything like that. They don't give us a reason to choose these two, and they don't really give us a strong reason to do this study, except it's a big problem. I understand it's a big problem, but we need to know something about why these two types of treatments can solve this problem. And if they told us that it's been shown to be effective in the literature, that would be already telling us something. They don't even tell us that this is effective in the literature. They just tell us what it is. The other thing that we often look for at the end of this introduction is a hypothesis. So what do they expect to happen? Do they expect systematic desensitization is better than implosion? Do they expect them to be equal? What are their expectations? We don't have any idea what their expectations. We don't even get it implicitly because they don't really tell us that they think one is going to work better than the other, or the literature's shown us that one works better than the other. So the introduction of this paper leaves a good amount to be desired. The method, let's start with the method. So I like to talk about who's in the study, and that's an important factor because it helps us to generalize to other people. So they found 50 participants who responded to newspaper advertisements. They were men and women between the ages of 21 and 65 in and around Chicago. So this is an older study. Not as many people read newspapers, but if it were a study that was done today, maybe we'd look at who reads newspapers and does this sample generalize to everybody? So we'd look at that question. So anytime we're looking at the sample, we're trying to figure out who it generalizes to. The other thing about newspaper is that people are reading this and feeling motivated to call in to be part of a study. So if you're part of a study on fear of flying, there's got to be some reason you called in. Many people who have anxiety just wouldn't bother, like, I don't want to deal with this. So the people who are calling in are motivated to change. And this is, with any sort of clinical study, quite often you're getting people who are calling in to be part of a study because they're motivated to change. So it just changes the study in some fashion, in that you're not getting everybody with fear of flying, and you're getting those who are motivated to change. So just a minor thing. The people in the study, we might not be able to generalize as much, but that's not the end of the study. This happens in a lot of clinical studies. We're getting our samples. They're going to be more convenient. We'd love to randomly sample people and find people on the street. Are you afraid of flying? You're part of my study, but we can't always do that. So, there's trade-offs with how we find people, and this study does have some trade-offs with how they found people. There are more females, more women than men, as they're describing. They're using a dichotomous gender scaling here, but which could be problematic. Maybe the study applies more to women than to men because we have an overabundance of one group versus the other. So that can sometimes bias the results, or maybe not necessarily bias the results, but maybe be less generalizable to everybody. We don't know anything about ethnic or racial background or demographics, SES, none of those other demographic factors that we might want to know about our sample, and that it would help us to generalize. All right, so the study, as you go through this, it might have been a little confusing to figure out the methods, because they start out, it's not necessarily a linear fashion that they start off with how they're assigned to groups. So I'm going to just describe this. Basically, people get on an airplane. They're part of the study. They get on an airplane. The engines start. They do a public address. These things happen, and then once the engines start, the tray table comes down, and they're asked to fill out this Mulhausen State Anxiety Scale. So it's a 10-item scale. So from there, we know how much their anxiety is at pre-test. So this is before intervention, before everything else. We know where their anxiety is. Then they're assigned to groups. So this is where I'm saying it's not a linear thing, because assignment to groups comes before you hear about what's actually happened in the study. So their assignment to groups by matched pairs. And what that means is, let's say I have the highest amount of anxiety. So I'm the top of the amount of anxiety. Let's say the next person with the highest amount of anxiety is matched with me. And then a coin flip, and I'm assigned to one group, that second person is assigned to another group. The reason they do matched pairs like this is that so that they're have an equal amount of anxiety in the groups. So it's not completely random assignment to the groups, because they want to make sure that implosion group has the same amount of anxiety as the systematic desensitization group. So that's why they're doing that matched pair. That's a perfectly acceptable method to make sure you're matching on a certain variable. So there was 16 pairs, so the two groups should have the same amount of anxiety because they've matched the amounts of anxiety. So the amount should be the same in the two groups. The measurement, this can be sometimes an issue. We're measuring a construct of anxiety. So how well we measure it, maybe we want to measure physiological response, maybe we want to measure other things. We're using this Mulhausen State Anxiety Scale, and it gets how they feel at the moment. Sounds pretty much like what we'd want to measure. It's a made-up measure because it's a made-up study. It was standardized on 280 college students from 18 to 23. It has retest reliability. We'll get into all of these terms later on in class, of 0.75, so it's relatively reliable. Maybe one concern is it's only tested on college students, and our study has people up until age 65. So having a measure that's only normed on college students and used across the age spectrum could be problematic. I don't have any reasons to suspect it is, but it could be. Maybe it only measures anxiety in college students really well and doesn't get at other anxiety in people who are older. Or it says here college students were 18 to 23. So just in younger students might be different than older adults who are not in college. And then, so here's the procedure. Some things about the procedure was that they're almost amplifying anxiety. I don't think even when the study was done or was thought to be done, they're warned not to smoke on the plane or the oxygen will explode. I don't think they usually say things like that on planes. Should the pilot have to ditch the plane into the sea? This is kind of amplifying things that might cause people to have anxiety. And then let's see. So the engine. So here's kind of the procedures. Engines were accelerated. They filled out this, and then they're assigned to groups. Then they go through the intervention, and a month later, they duplicate that session again with the same exact procedures. So they go on an airplane, take a measure to see how anxious they are, go through an intervention, and then get the same procedure done again for post-test. So they have a pre-test, post-test. They talk about the treatment here, and then they go into the results. Now, we still don't know what the research questions were. We don't know what their hypotheses were. So I'm going to make up what their hypotheses were. I think they're looking at two hypotheses. One, do these treatments work? So either treatment, does it work? Do we see a change in anxiety? So I'm going to call that hypothesis one. The second hypothesis is, does one work better than the other? Does desensitization work better than implosion? So that's hypothesis two. So when I read results, I can go ahead and read through this, but for the most part, authors put the most important results in figures and tables. So I'll often just look at the figures and tables and I can figure out what's happening in the study. So if we look here at table 1, they have the scores for pre-test, post-test of the two groups. And so we can kind of look at the scores. But actually in figure 1, they have the same scores, and it's just a little bit easier to see in figure 1 what's happening in the study. So in figure 1, this is what I'm looking at here. what we see is a pre-test and post-test along the x-axis, and then their anxiety score on the y-axis. So we see the desensitization group with the circles, and then the implosion group with the triangles. Hypothesis 1. Is there a change over time? Do these treatments work? On the surface, I would say, yeah, it looks like they're both going down across time. It looks like both groups are better at post-test. If we think about it, though, and how the study design was, and this is where I want you to be critical consumers of research, if you read just the abstract, it's going to say that these treatments work. But when we think about it, people got onto an airplane, a really scary message came on. There was actually, if you read deeper into the article, they're talking about somebody was in the fetal position asking to be off the plane. There's all kinds of things happening in that first time point. And then they realize, hey, we're not taking off. So they fill out their measure, and then they realize we're not taking off, and then they go and get refreshments afterwards. So just making it through that first time, the second time you probably are thinking, well, we're not going to take off. Last time we didn't take off. We're just getting on this plane to fill out this measure. So the practice effect of going through it the first time, the second time you just realize, oh, we're not going to take off. I can get on a plane and hear the engines and hear the message, could be the main reason we have this effect here. So just because they were exposed to the plane before and then the second time exposed again, that could be the reason that everybody went down. The other part of this, hypothesis 2, is that one group better than the other. And if we look at this implosion group looks like it went down a little bit more than the systematic desensitization group. So does this group do better? And on the surface, again, it looks like they do. If I go above and read the stats, it looks like they do. However, again, if we think about it, we did this matching procedure at the beginning, and the two groups should have been matched. So these pre-test scores at the beginning should be almost exactly the same, and they're not. And if we read through the article, we found out that people were left the study. So after that first session, people were leaving the study, and more people left the implosion group than the desensitization group. And what might have happened is a sort of a survival of the fittest. The people who were left in the implosion group kind of did well because they could handle it. And the people who left weren't going to do as well anyways, and they left. So what we might have is an effect. So the reason that they're different at the beginning could be that the people who had higher anxiety left the study, so the people that were here could actually handle the treatment and handled it better than the people who left the study. So this attrition might have biased our results. So this is another factor of attrition. We'll talk about these confounds to studies, but just leaving the study might have made the results slightly different. One thing that we'll talk about is how do we make a study better? And one thing we could do is add a control group. If we had a group that got no treatment whatsoever and we still saw this decline, then we would say that the treatments don't work. It's just a practice effect. If the control group starts off up high and stays high, then we can say, hey, treatment did work because the control group didn't change at all, so it's not the practice effect. So the control group would help us eliminate the practice effect, the idea that the practice effect might have confounded the results. What I take from the study is very little. Like I can't really rely on the results. And a lot of the studies that we'll talk about in class, it won't be as distinct as this. But in this case, I don't know if I take anything from the results just because of those big confounds that might have affected the outcome. So, kind of looking at bigger picture, that's what the next step we'd do is look at what can we take from these results, apply it clinically, what can we take from these results to apply to public policy, those type of things. I don't really take I don't have faith in the results enough to then take it to another step and say that we should be implementing implosion therapy for everyone or anything along those lines. I don't see that in here. Let me give you one other key. Again, I look at figures and tables, and usually you can figure out what's going on with the study with figures and tables. The other thing are these long statements that we see in research articles. And we'll go over this, what it means in more detail in later classes. But what it's telling you is that there's a ANOVA test. It gives you an F. This one tells you degrees number of groups. Basically, there's 2 groups, so 2 minus. We won't get into this right now. But anyways, all of this is mumbo jumbo at first. This is what the ANOVA test result is. All of that could be eliminated. It's a relic of times when we used to hand calculate things and people might double check other researchers' work to see if these numbers are correct. All of these things could probably be eliminated, and the end part is what's really important. So that end is p less than 0.001. So that's one way I think about it, is the probability that the null hypothesis is true. And again, the null hypothesis is nothing is happening. So the probability that nothing is happening is less than 0.00001. So it's a really, really small chance that nothing is happening. So therefore, I reject the null hypothesis. If this is less than 0.05, less than a 5% chance, then I'm going to reject the null hypothesis. So in this situation, it's really, really small. So whenever you see p less than a really small number, that means they've rejected the null hypothesis. They found something. So here p less than 0.05, they found something. They found this interaction, meaning that there's differential effects over time for the different treatments. This is overall there's a effect of therapy. So if you want to read this, you can kind of ignore much of this other stuff and just look for p less than 0.05 or p less